We're going to start off in our opening. I'm really delighted to have with us Andy Potter, who is Executive Director of the Michigan Corrections Organization, and really one of the more most significant people right now in corrections in the U.S. He's involved in a lot of things, as he'll tell you, and we're particularly asking him to talk about his work at One Voice United, which is a national nonprofit that helps correctional officers input into the national dialogue. And of course, there's no more important agenda item of the dialogue right now than COVID-19. So, Andy, and you've got some videos and a slide presentation as well. So I'll let you take it away. Welcome to our conference series, Andy.
Thanks. I appreciate it so much. Hello, everybody. And I appreciate being here, spending time, and sharing some of the experiences from corrections officers and frontline staff who work inside of the prisons all across the United States, and now work inside of a very challenging situation on top of that with COVID-19. My name is Andy Potter. I am the Executive Director for Michigan Corrections Organization, and I'm also the founder of One Voice United. I've worked in and around the criminal justice system and prisons for 30 years, and I can assure everyone that I have seen a lot of pain on both sides of this system. And the other thing I can say is over those 30 years that I'm pretty convinced of is that America is fascinated by law enforcement and by corrections. The unfortunate part is that they are fascinated for the wrong reasons. You can turn on your television set and you can watch multiple channels and shows and movies that really set a narrative about who corrections officers are. And we call this the Shawshank Narrative. It's movies like Shawshank that really set the stage for how corrections is viewed. And without an alternative narrative, society just believes that that's what goes on and that's what happens on a day-to-day basis. And there's always a good guy and a villain in every TV show and movie. And the corrections officers, generally speaking, seem to be placed in the villain category almost every single time. I believe that the untold stories that take place are stories that could change or at least disrupt that narrative that's been set. So if you don't mind, when we start out, I'd like to take just a few minutes and share with you who I am and what brought me to this profession, because if you know who I am, then you're going to know a little bit more about who corrections officers are, because we share a lot of the same stories. And throughout our time together, I hope I bring other perspectives that'll help challenge the set narrative and give a firsthand account of what officers are dealing with right now with COVID inside of the prison system. I started in corrections as an officer in 1989, and I was 21 years old. I grew up in a very broken family in a very rural area in Michigan, where my friends and I really didn't see higher ed as a pathway. From where we were sitting, our options were really the military, going to work for Oldsmobile, or corrections. And I can tell you that when we were growing up, we weren't dreaming about being corrections officers, but it was in the 80s and getting tough on crime. Everything was about getting tough on crime. And being a corrections officer in the 80s was considered a pretty good job. It was a pathway that most of us saw that could bring us into a living wage and maybe even into the middle class. So a lot of prisons were being built in the 80s all around us in these rural areas where there might have already been an industry that was starting to fail, like logging or mining or even factory work, that wasn't successful or starting to fail, and they would put a prison in these rural areas. And some of us really saw that as a pathway. It really became an option for us. So let's fast forward 30 years. I've had 30 years in the system, and that still stands true. A lot of new recruits that I talk to, and I talk to most, will tell you the same story that I would have told you, that they took this job to get into the middle class, perhaps. They saw it as a pathway. And along the way, if they can make the difference in one person's life, if they can set an example, then that sounds like a great idea. So I founded One Voice United because over those 30 years, I saw a lot of changes in corrections. And as you all know, through the 80s and 90s, the pendulum was swinging through up to reform and then back to warehousing. It was really volatile, but the profession was changing daily almost. And corrections officers weren't being consulted. They weren't being brought into that conversation to help shape what that work looked like. So it was just the system imposing. So I founded One Voice to bring those corrections officers' voices inside of that so that they could help shape what their work would look like. In the past several years, I started to notice how criminal justice really started to take root. It wasn't like the pendulum any longer. It really was like, look, reform is getting traction and it's going to stay. And that means our jobs are going to be transformed for the better, we hope, right? But our voices still were not in this. Everything I read, everything I saw, everyone I learned from or listened to, from politicians to academia to celebrities, you couldn't see or hear corrections officers' voices anywhere in that conversation. It's as though they were missing. They were being written out of the story. And I couldn't find quotes or anything. And being the second largest stakeholder in corrections, you would assume that our voices would be directly connected. So One Voice team decided to split up and go across the country and talk to everyone who was moving corrections reform. We talked with Van Jones, we talked to Brian Stevenson, Grover Norquist, and everybody in between, including the White House. And we asked some simple questions like, were the officers involved in your thinking in this? Was there surveys given? Or were they connected to? And is there an appetite? Is there room for corrections officers to have their voices in this? And is there room for us to connect on the common ground issues to try to build something? And the answers were mostly no. Corrections officers were not consulted. They were not viewed as the professional consultants. They were not interviewed or given surveys. And that nobody was doing this work. And so we asked, is there room for this work? And almost everybody we talked to said, absolutely, there's room for this work, and you should keep pushing it. After we had a lot of those kinds of conversations, we really found that there was some blind spots in reform. The lives of those folks that were incarcerated and those that were working in those prison systems were inextricably linked in a lot of ways. And those we found to be common ground issues, common ground areas, like the food quality, the overcrowding, understaffing, the mental health and wellness, and the safety. And the truth of the matter is really that the system that was designed in corrections really wasn't designed for success for anyone. Not those that are living there, incarcerated, and not those that work there. So I want to show you an example of what I believe to be one of the greatest untold stories about corrections officers who work in the correction system. They suffer from depression, PTSD, and commit suicide at rates that are much higher than law enforcement staff and other agencies, and even those in the military. Most of these studies are recent and have just started over the past 5 to 7 years. So there's a lot of this kind of information that's still going unreported or is unknown. Corrections officers are really built to keep those kinds of experiences to themselves. They don't share a lot, so it's not easy to get this kind of information, but it's what we do. So if you fast forward a little to 2020, we have what you might call the perfect storm brewing. We already have health and wellness crisis for those on the front lines and those living behind the walls as well. We have looming budget crisis now in state and local communities because of COVID that could further defund some of the essential programs. We've got a growing tension in society over anti-law enforcement movements. And then you lay COVID-19 on top of that, that's just ravaging through the prison system. And the corrections voices are still either excluded or ignored by large when it comes to the reform efforts that are being expedited or accelerated because of COVID. So their voices still just aren't being heard. But in the middle of all of this, there is those silver linings. There's that hope that exists that mostly goes unwritten about and goes untold and unreported. This is a letter, this is a blog that was written by someone who's incarcerated. And I'm not going to read the entire letter, but they're going to post it so that you can read it. It's really worth reading. I encourage you to do it. It's someone who's really talking about the extra care that some corrections officers are taking during COVID with someone that meant an awful lot to this other person who was incarcerated, and they almost died. But because of the actions of those corrections officers going above and beyond and really showing how much they cared, he was able to come back. Now, the circumstances aren't good for anybody in prison on any given time or day, but this is a great example of an untold story where this person even recognized the challenges that corrections officers faced being frontline staff and struggling with management and trying to keep people safe and their own families safe. We have stories of corrections officers living in tents and quarantining and working multiple double shifts. They're exhausted. So this kind of gives you a firsthand glimpse at some of that. Over the past several months, One Voice has really reached out to a lot of frontline staff all across the country to find out what was really going on in there. This was early on in the pandemic, and we were trying to sort out what was real and what wasn't. We sent out staff surveys, and we conducted Zoom conferences and YouTube presentations to try to gather as much information as we could. So we sent out one survey that more than 1,200 corrections officers took across the country. Only 7% of those who responded said their facility was very equipped to handle this emergency or crisis, which isn't overly surprising considering the entire nation really wasn't equipped to handle it, it seems. But the top three concerns that officers expressed about the risk they were facing inside the facilities was a lack of proactive testing, the poor communication contributing to stress and uncertainty, the lack of protective gear such as gloves and masks. 62% of the respondents said that they still don't have all the tools that they need to do their job in this time of crisis. And 67% of the respondents said neither they or their union or any line staff have been invited to help build any protocols or new operating procedures since COVID-19 hit. More than half of those who responded said that the problems and hazards inside their facilities related to this pandemic still remain unaddressed. So after learning a lot about those issues and hearing what was really going on, One Voice United really decided to do a rapid response. And some of the highlights to that response were out of the surveys findings, we created a national protection resolution with 15 key policies and procedures that we sent to the National Governors Association. This was what we considered to be the ground floor of what folks needed when they walked inside those gates to try to protect everybody that was inside and themselves from bringing COVID inside to taking it home. We also posted that resolution and cover letter on social media and received over 2,000 signatures from individual corrections officers from across the country supporting that. We sent a letter to CDC with other suggestions as another attempt to ensure better protections for everyone that was inside of those prisons. We did a national press release. We did podcasts and op-eds to raise more awareness. And some of the recommendations, I will just tell you, is to limit the number of people entering and exiting the facilities. This was early on. And early on, they weren't really limiting that number. They were just allowing activities to continue as they were. And it was really causing some stress-related issues. Decontamination stations for all facilities entering and exiting. I still don't think that that's being done. Accurate and consistent and frequent communication to inform everyone of policy changes and to help lower the anxiety around the unknown and the rumors, which we know wasn't just in the prison system. That was in all over the place in America. There was inaccurate, inconsistent messaging going on. Policies that covered the sick leave and hazardous pay and accommodations for staff when the virus rebounds and starts to spread again, and national protocols to deal with future pandemics. We felt like they waited way too long, and there still is not a national protocol to follow inside of the correctional facilities. So I'm going to finish up soon, but I want to leave you with some reflections and some possibilities on how we can look ahead. The pandemic really revealed long-standing issues that went mostly unheard and unreported. The crisis is not over. Even though there's been ups and downs in some states and communities, the crisis inside of the prison system has been continuing since day one. And health experts they're suggesting that there's a possible third wave coming. Now, we're inside of a second wave perhaps right now, but we know that that third wave could still take place before there's enough vaccines to go around. And the situation inside the facilities isn't any better today than it was when COVID first initially began to go through the prison system. Those working and living inside of facilities, they shouldn't be forgotten about because a lot of them feel like that's what's going on. The experience and perspective and the wisdom of those on the front lines are really vital components to managing and mitigating this crisis. And if I could emphasize this one, when reporting on stories about the pandemic inside prisons, please remember that there's a lot of these untold stories. And by including those voices of corrections officers and other frontline staff, you can really help disrupt that false narrative that's out there. I'm going to leave you with this video, but I think it's really important to understand that during this national state of emergency, that corrections officers and staff across this country are being asked to report to duty. regardless of their circumstances, regardless of the circumstances inside of the prisons and how bad it gets. They want to report to work. They want to do their job the best they can. Because of the 24/7 nature of corrections, it really makes it a profession where officers and staff don't get to self-isolate at home with their families like the rest of Americans are told to do. And they really can't come to work and social distance either. So everyone inside of there is afraid for their life. And they're seeing it play out across America, and they're all feeling like they're being forgotten about. So I'm hoping that you'll see this collection of corrections officers and leaders' voices that One Voice has gathered to give you a firsthand perspective of what they're dealing with and some of the emotion that goes behind that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Seems as though we're having some difficulties with the volume.
I wonder if we can maybe hold off the video if we can't hear it. I don't know if Corey is able to help us. We can try it again. Unless, Michael, can you play your video from, can you try sharing your video from your end? There you go.
Neighborhood projects have been happening across the country, and the conversations we've been having feel more relevant and more meaningful than ever before. And few groups have a more important yet untold story than the often overlooked men and women who do one of America's toughest jobs, corrections officers.
Corrections is a profession that most people don't understand until you're one of us.
And I was told when I first started, in the public eye, you're always the villain, you're never the hero.
It's not Shawshank Redemption.
We all are human, and we all have families.
Without a doubt, there is no other profession in the world right now that is in a crisis situation as much as we are, with the exception of the healthcare providers. We are on the front lines. We are the first responders.
It all started with a riot a week ago, and it's been going downhill from there.
The virus invades the institution, and then they're running around trying to put out these little fires by stomping on them. But from our experience, the bad part is once it's into the institution, it's too late. It's like a brush fire. It starts at one side of the facility, and until it runs out of human beings, it continues to burn through your population.
There's 688 total inmates, 286 tested positive.
About 900 officers that's out quarantined or tested positive.
We have 479 inmates that have tested positive. As of yesterday, we lost our 21st inmate.
We're not used to this kind of threat. We're really prepared to die at the hands of an inmate, but not a microorganism.
20% of the officers don't even have face masks. 25% of the officers don't have hand sanitizer. We're in the middle of an epidemic and 14 of us are dead.
We've got officers who said, look, this isn't even like a prison anymore. It's so bad. Broke down and said, look, I'm really struggling. I mean, he's living in his driveway in a camper. His daughter has one lung, and he's scared to death that he's going to bring something to his daughter.
Some of our staff have gotten to the point of where we don't call ourselves essential, we call ourselves sacrificial. We lost our first employee yesterday. She was a 37-year-old young lady, and she died in the line of duty. You go from being shattered to angry, and you just try to explain that to her father.
It's a reality check for all of us. I've lost members, and others on this call have lost members. I'd like to take a moment of silence.
Gosh, I hope we don't lose anybody. I'm with you guys, and you know, whatever I can do for you from Colorado, let me know.
We used to shake hands and hug each other coming in and out to say hi, and we can't do that now. I miss the camaraderie where we can embrace each other, because we need that. And that simple handshake or that simple hug on your way in and out, sometimes that's all we got to get us through to the next day.
Part of the challenge for people in corrections is that you're so well trained not to show vulnerability. If you were gonna, for a second, let down the guard of we got this, what would be the truth that you would want to tell?
We're dedicated to what we do. We refuse to walk out of work or not come to work because we have our communities to protect. And that's what keeps us going back to work each and every day.
I've never been more proud in my position in the past 6 years as I've been in the last month. We do deserve to go home and be able to see our families and take care of our families like everyone else.
Folks want to get back to normal, but you know, I'm just saying normal for us, it wasn't good enough then. So I don't want to go back to normal after this.
If nothing else comes from this, I'm hopeful that there'll be a breath of unity across the country for all of us. And something like that, the idea of a neighborhood, that's what we are. We are a community.
Well, thank you, Andy. That's a really powerful video, as I'm sure all of you agree. And we do have the link on our site if you guys will look at it again. I neglected to mention when I was introducing folks, Corey Post, whose picture you see on the screen, and she's been working with Andy and helping us get his video on the screen. So thank you, Corey, for being part of this. Let me, there's a lot of questions we've got already in our Q&A section, but I wanted to start the conversation off, since you did mention vaccinations, and that's really high on the agenda right now in the country. The Prison Policy Initiative came out with a study this morning, which is on the Crime Report site, which noted that some 36 states have agreed to prioritize incarcerated staff and incarcerees to get the vaccinations when they're available to them. 12 states haven't, and there's still an open question about who you prioritize and at what point. And I wonder, Andy, if you could give us your thoughts on that. Correctional staff were obviously essential workers, and the states that aren't even thinking of them, putting them on the list, obviously behind everybody else. But what's the stage? Should they both be getting the priority at the same time? Should they be on the same phase? Be interesting to hear your point of view on that.
So we haven't taken a position on this yet. There's still a lot of conversation. You know, typically speaking, One Voice United doesn't take a position unless we've talked to a lot of staff from around the country. We try not to take a position because we think it's the right thing or we think it's the wrong thing, because we believe that that's what's going on outside of the work that we're trying to do. The work we try to do is bring those voices to the table and bring those perspectives, not just our own. So that's a conversation that's still being had. And as you know, most of America struggles with whether or not they want to be vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And I believe you're going to have the same kind of conversation unfold inside of the prison system with those who are incarcerated and those that are working there. So I don't want to take a position yet on whether or not I think it's the right thing to do, but I will share this. I don't know how much good it will do to have folks that are incarcerated be vaccinated and those who come in there every day to work not vaccinated. Now, the vaccination's not a cure, right? And folks sometimes talk about these vaccinations like it's a cure. And it's really another step in mitigating, and it's another step in stamping it out, but it's not exactly a cure either. So
I think the issue has often been placed the other way around, that there's a lot of agreement that correctional staff should be vaccinated, but whether or not incarcerees should have the same priority, it seems to be a matter of debate, certainly in some places. I mean, are you guys lobbying at all?
I would argue the same argument, Stefan, that I argued when it came to the protections. Every single person in those facilities, whether they're living there or working there, deserve to be safe. And they deserve everything we can do to help make that possible. And if that means they all get N95 masks, then they all should get them. Now, as it is, we don't even have that to go around for those that are incarcerated and working there for either side of this. So I think anything we can do to help or to offer that, we should, for sure.
So let's go to the question. We've got a lot of them. We're not going to be able to cover them, probably all of them in the time remaining. And those we don't, we'll bundle and send to you, Angie, separately for answering later. But first one is from Lynn Anderson, who's a senior editor for Health and Medicine at The Conversation, who called your talk fascinating and eye-opening, which I agree. And she says, do you know if any scholars and academics have studied particularly the high rates of PTSD among corrections officers? I mean, is there research out there that you're using and that journalists can use?
Yes, we have someone that we've conducted studies and surveys with, Katerina Spinaris, and we can give you a link for that as well.
That would be good.
But there's several out there that really do this kind of work, but it's relatively new on the scene in the past 5 years. I know when I started to research this about 7 years ago, there was hardly any research being done at that point. But thankfully, there's more and more doing that kind of work now.
There's a question. I'm going to move quickly to a question from Aaron Morrison, which I think is related to the first one, which is that you mentioned in your talk some of the rising tensions that you're feeling, correctional staff are feeling about anti-law enforcement activism, that you've been lumped into that same kind of movement. But could you clarify whether you mean tension on the outside seeping into correctional facilities, or is it something else? And maybe some examples would help in terms of how corrections officers are experiencing that.
So corrections officers primarily feel like they are an arm of law enforcement, and sometimes they're viewed in the same light. And when there's a lot of news about law enforcement, then that's the same light is casted on corrections officers, and they feel a certain amount of betrayal when they're just casted into a bad light. It's there's a lot of stories that aren't told that are good stories that keep getting brought up. And I'd also like to say this: the system that we work in, corrections, is really, from day one, you feel like you can make a difference, but the system is not designed that way, as we know. And the light goes out of your eyes because they won't allow you to be a coach, a mentor. They won't allow you to have any kind of vested interest in success. That's why I say the system wasn't designed for success for anybody, anyone who comes into contact with it. And that's why reform is important for everyone's sake.
So the question that follows this is from Ron Burler, which is, if you can tell us a little bit about what reactions you've gotten so far to your recommendations from state or federal legislators. It's a question, I guess, about the strength of One Voice United, is whether you've had any real impact on state policies anywhere.
I think if you look at the resolutions that we've sent out and the policy suggestions, some of those now are being enacted. We have met and talked with the National Governors Association. We have talked with folks from CDC. So we can only hope that we've made an impact early on. And when we had these conversations, it was very early on. And in these individual states, we believe that the governors have met with some of our leaders and have taken some of these protocols on. And across the board, we're seeing some of those enacted, but it's still not enough. It's still not soon enough. And we feel like there could be a lot more of attention paid to some of those policies.
Thank you. Michael, can you read the question from Kelly Davis on the list?
Sure. So Kelly Davis is a freelance journalist, and her question is referring to getting the voices of corrections officers into our stories. So it is tough when journalists fear retaliation and can only be quoted. When corrections officers feel retaliation and can only be quoted anonymously. Do you have any suggestions for finding folks who might be willing to speak on the record with their names included?
It's hard. It's really difficult. Even for us, corrections officers are reluctant. In some states like mine in Michigan, it's to even speak to a legislator. If it's your legislator and you want to speak to them about an issue, a growing concern, you still have to write out a report that you spoke to a legislator about some of your concerns. So the restraints on corrections officers really are limited. But I would suggest if you could talk to the unions about what some of those concerns are. They speak on behalf of those officers. And a lot of times those unions, such as my own, can give you supporting documentation and can shield those officers a little bit so that they will speak out.
I want to follow it up because this is I think points to a really important issue. The media experience in covering corrections is hard enough, getting into prisons and getting access to information, but getting close to guards and getting the correctional staff's point of view has always been difficult. There's always been a stereotype, as you said at the beginning of your talk, about correctional staff, and the going approach, the kind of trope about corrections unions is that they usually on the conservative side of justice reforms, and your group, One Voice United, is singular in that respect. It's the only group that I know of when we first talked a year ago that's really out there talking about giving a voice to some of what correctional staff really feel about the system itself. So I mean, it's a problem, I think, for the media to really get this kind of stories you want them to cover when some of the unions themselves won't really talk to people.
No, the fact of the matter is we have not done a good enough job as leaders bringing our officers to this conversation. We resisted, and instead of being a resource to making the conditions better for those who live there, we're going to make the conditions better for those who work there as well. The problem is early on in reform movement, those officers weren't brought to that conversation in a way that says, look, the reform agenda can include those that work there. We should want to raise that profession up. That's another problem when there's a policy taken and publicly by groups, by politicians or policymakers, is that you have politicians and others that are willing to run right to those vocal policies instead of bringing all the stakeholders together. Think about this. It's the second largest stakeholder possibly in reform is those who work inside of those facilities. Now, the reforms, when they're talked about, the narrative is set in many of their minds that it's only about those who are incarcerated. It's our job to really inform them that, look, that agenda can be wide and vast. We should want to rethink and reimagine the work that we do and bring them to that. And One Voice is trying to do that. If we can unearth those common ground places, now we won't agree on everything. And it's a culture that's handed down from generation to generation about what's a good corrections officer. And society tells us what's a good corrections officer. Because, you know, I think, it's my opinion here, that America really views prisons as a place to punish people. And that's the American way of thinking. And if you go to other countries, Norway and other Scandinavian countries especially, that is not the mindset. There's still a lot of dignity and respect and understanding, and it's viewed as a place to help, not punish.
Yes,
and
there
so
are
we have to
interesting-
break free of that. So
There are interesting models out there that we really usually fail to look at when we think about corrections in Scandinavia and Germany and places like that. And that's worth a whole different session, I think. But Chandra Bazelko has a very good follow-up question to the one I just asked. She says, you know, if having corrections officers in the narrative is so important and that they need to be heard by the media and by the public, so, you know, there are union contracts that prohibit this. And, you know, do you think that they should be changed, or can they be altered to allow them to talk to the public, to the press?
I think that corrections officers are, especially state and local corrections officers, those are public servants. They should be able to speak about what's going on in there. A lot of times we talk about privatization, prison systems that are privatized, and there's not enough transparency. And that's one of the criticisms, which rightfully so. And I also think there's not enough transparency when it comes to state correctional facilities either. I know a lot of reporters have called me and said, we can't get the Department of Corrections to answer our questions truthfully or in a way that we can follow up. And we have to do a better job as unions and as leaders inside of corrections to make that available too. But yeah, I think everyone should be able to speak freely about what's going on. That's human life in there.
It may not be in the interest of state corrections officers.
Not always, no.
I think to allow you guys to speak more
Yeah.
freely. That's one of the problems.
The fight will continue, trust me.
Let's move back to the direct COVID questions. There's a question from Victoria Law. Michael, I wonder if you could read that.
Sure. So Victoria Law, who's a freelance journalist, says, I've heard numerous stories from incarcerated people and family members in various states about correctional officers not wearing their masks properly, refusing to wear masks, and or telling people that the COVID-19 pandemic does not exist. What kinds of education does One Voice United and the Michigan Corrections Organization provide to its members to push them to utilize PPE? And what kinds of support does either group give for officers to educate their peers who may not be using PPE or who may believe that COVID does not exist?
Everything we talk about is really about protecting and yourself and those that you're in charge of. And that also includes wearing your PPEs. In fact, we deliver PPEs when we didn't have enough in Michigan to every single work site, every single shift, to every single officer that we could come into contact with. We secured those PPEs and we handed those out ourselves in Michigan. And One Voice, and so we encourage people to wear their PPEs. Now, everyone, while they're in working inside, keep in mind that neither those that work there or those who are incarcerated constantly want to wear a mask, especially in the summer. It was 100 and some degrees in some of those facilities. This is misunderstood. A lot of facilities, they don't have air conditioning and things, and it's very hot. I'm not giving an excuse. I'm just saying there's instances where that happens. We frown on it, we discourage it, and we do everything we can do to provide PPE and tell them to wear it.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but there's one final question I wanted to get in there. It's a factual question, if you can answer it, from Victoria Law again, who says that you mentioned in your survey that only 7% of those respondents in your survey felt their facilities were equipped for the pandemic. Can you tell us which states they were in, or is that have you?
So the surveys So the surveys that we give don't necessarily always identify the state or the correctional facility to keep those officers safe. So, but I can share some of that information if we have it. Corey and I can talk afterwards and try to collect what we have and send it to you, Stefan, if you want to pass it on.
That would be great. So I mean, I'm sure our folks will have lots more questions as they ponder what you said, and we'll pass them on to you. But I want to thank you, Andy, for a really provocative and moving talk. It's a good start to our day, and I hope you can stay on with us for the rest of the afternoon if you're able to. But thanks to both you and Corey for your help today. So we'll take a quick 10-minute-ish break, and we'll be back around 2 o'clock, 2:05. Thank you all.
Thanks. I appreciate it.